Thank you and welcome back to those of you who were able to join us this morning. I'm sure you had it was a great conversation, which we will be continuing now. I want to just, for those of you who are just joining us now, I want to go over just a couple housekeeping rules. So as a reminder, please no eating and drinking. Also, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the day. As you will see over here, there is a QR code. Please scan that and please ask your questions. The moderators will be receiving those questions and be able to respond to those accordingly. And with that, we will begin with our first panel of the day. So empirical and technological questions, current landscape, challenges, and opportunities. And I will turn it over to Dean Chang.
All right. Welcome back. Oh, this one works. Nice. It's really wonderful to see how we all interact this morning, see the wonderful presentation from the keynote speakers. Thank you. And also we received a lot of questions from the audience here and also online. Only have time to ask maybe a few. So we'll continue that. This panel will focus on empirical and technological questions. And then following later today, there'll be a legal, philosophical question will be moderated by Jaimes, right? So let's start it with this panel. And let me just jump into the question, if that's okay with our panelists. And then when we invite you to start answer the question, maybe for the first question, you can take 1 or 2 minutes to introduce yourself and what you have done, what's your journey to generative AI, what's the successful achievement or pitfall or surprise in the first 1 or 2 minutes before you answer the question. So my first question is about several issues identified by the keynote speaker this morning, right? There's a lot of fear and worry that AI tool may fall into the hands of bad actors, helping them create fake content, as we saw Sora and this Dall-E, ChatGPT for text generation. And not only that, also this content disinformation can be easily distributed to a massive number of users quickly. So in your view, do AI tools, they undermine the public discourse system we need in a functional democracy? What's your assessment of the state of AI technology that may be used to undermine a trustworthy public discourse system? Are you worried? And so let me start with that. So maybe start with this and go in that way.
Thanks,
Alex.
So thank you for having me. So I'm Alex Jaimes. I'm with Dataminr, where I'm Chief Scientist and SVP of AI. I've been at the company for about 5.5 years. And what we do is we ingest public data sources. We find events and send alerts about these events. And they range from emergency response events to events that are important for anything that is meaningful, public opinions, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been working in AI for many, many years. I'm a Columbia alumni. I don't think the question is whether it will fall into the wrong hands. I think it's already in the wrong hands. There's no question about it. One of the things that has changed in the last few years is that the community of practitioners of AI has expanded very significantly. 10 years ago, maybe as little as 5 years ago, that community was very small, and the people that knew how to use AI and leverage it was tiny. Now, even the larger technical conferences host 10,000 people, and some of the key innovations are coming from gamers and people that have no background in AI. So we shouldn't underestimate the fact that the bar is lower to access these technologies and to leverage them and use them. And therefore, I am worried because I do think that the bad actors already have their hands on them. It's too late to stop it. It's already open source, which has both created many opportunities for good and many opportunities for bad. And we can get into it more later, but I think it's the perfect storm in the sense that the platforms are there to quickly distribute information. The tools are there to create it. And people are used to consuming that information, resharing, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you worried?
I am worried, yes. But
okay, we'll talk about solution and mitigation later. Kathy?
So I'm Kathy McKeown. I'm a professor in the computer science department here at Columbia. And I've been working on AI since I think longer than anybody here. My research has been in language generation and summarization. So it was very interesting to me to see the changes when large language models came out. So I'll comment on a couple of things. One is sort of how well they do work in the field of summarization. And we did some benchmarking work. Actually, it was joint between Columbia and Stanford with Tatsu Hashimoto's group on benchmarking large language models in summarization of news, a single news article in, a summary out. And our benchmarking shows that people judge summaries of news articles comparably to summaries written by humans. So on a number of different factors, including faithfulness, misinformation. So when generated by an instruct model and in a zero-shot setting. And so we saw there that 99% of the summaries generated in that way are faithful. So, the first reaction is, okay, this is a solved problem, but it's not. When we look at other genres and other work on summarization, we see that, so for example, if we were summarizing dialogues, meetings, for example, we're looking at summarizing narratives, the problem gets much worse. What I think is most difficult is that when the output is generated, it's so plausible that people often miss the fact that some of what is generated is incorrect. In fact, it can be very hard to even evaluate systems the way we have done it for years with people looking at it, because it's hard for them to detect that there is an error. Mm-hmm. So I think summarization can be quite useful online, but so long as we have this problem where there's false information and it's hard to detect it, I think that's going to be a real problem for the everyday person. They will not know that what they're reading has something that's false in it.
So on summarization related to public discourse system, maybe some of the tool system in political or social discussion, the AI tool used for summarizing multiple sources will be used. And if you cannot check the factuality, that could be one serious concern.
Yes. So I am going to talk about it a little bit later in my talk, but yes, summarization should be good for public discourse because it should be able to highlight what a lot of people are thinking about a particular topic, a particular candidate, a policy, or so forth. But yes, we do have to be very careful that the output is correct.
Fantastic. Thank you. Smaranda.
Hi everyone. I'm Smaranda Muresan. I'm a research scientist at the Data Science Institute as well as a visiting associate professor at Barnard College. My area is also natural language processing, and I work a lot in kind of developing this natural language processing tool in a human-centric way and kind of design with the goal of problem solving in different domains like public health or computational social science and in responsible ways. So going to the question, and I think kind of echoing a bit what Alec was saying, well, yes, we are at the stage where these large language models are generating plausible output, very good output, and there is a cause for concern, but I think there are also opportunity in developing the AI technologies kind of to capture this type of output. And I want to give an example. Ketin was mentioning of how the summarization by the system versus the human, and we did an experiment. I work a lot in kind of creativity and creative text generation. And what we noticed there is if you develop a proper way of how you develop to evaluate what is a good output in terms of, let's say, creative output, there where the language models are really not good. So the experts and the output generated is actually really, really low, depending on different criteria and how you evaluate that. So we are still, I would say we are still not there to kind of generate really output that can fool, for example, a proper evaluation technology. However, in the misinformation domain, and we're going to talk more about mitigation, we could have some output like that.
So I'd love to learn more about the creativity and how do you assess or measure.
So I will be happy to, I'm not sure if now or maybe in the later.
We'll go through the round and we'll come back to this question. Arvind.
Great. My name is Arvind Narayanan. I'm a computer science professor at Princeton. What I'm perhaps best known for is this newsletter that I write with my co-author Sayash Kapoor called AI Snake Oil. And what we try to do is look at all the AI hype that's in the news and maybe look at it critically and take it down a peg. Now, the reason I mention that is because while it's important to look at AI hype coming from companies critically, I think it's also important to look at AI fears critically and ask, is this actually as dangerous as this is being made out to be? And the answer is not clear to me. And so, over the last 20 years, I've been thinking about the risks of emerging technologies. That's broadly what I do research on. And the most useful thing I've learned, perhaps, is this very nice aphorism that I actually learned from Bruce Schneier, who's a keynote speaker later today. And he says, if it's in the news, don't worry about it. And what he means is that the kinds of things that are newsworthy are things that are kind of exotic, which happen very rarely and therefore are interesting to write about or show in the news. But the kinds of harms that are actually widespread that are happening to everyone are not in the news because you already know about them. So, from that perspective, I don't mean to say that there's nothing to worry about, but, are we worried about the right things? So let me propose that maybe rather than bad actors, or, maybe in addition to bad actors, the kinds of things we should be thinking about are the things that are much more widespread, which is everyday people using generative AI and what that does to truth online. So today, you can just take a photo and you can use your regular photo app, which all of you have on your phones, to add a picture of balloons to your birthday party, for instance, right? That was never there and it's perfectly convincing. And that's the new normal on social media, right? And so what does that mean, when we're scrolling through this all day, every day, and we no longer have any idea which of these actually happened and which of it was AI generated? So the term that people use for that is the liar's dividend. Right, so it's so rather than bad actors, injecting false information into the discourse, they can take advantage of the fact that information that may or may not be false is already so pervasive to be able to say, a politician can say about information that was inconvenient for them. They can say, that's AI generated. And from what I understand, that's actually been happening far more often than the actual use of deep fakes to fool anyone. So that's the kind of thing I worry about. I worry about what authoritarians are going to do with this. The idea that there is misinformation out there and so we should control things is like the #1 reason that authoritarians use to pass laws restricting free speech all over the world. And so that's kind of the converse of the problem we've been talking about. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the US is in a pretty good place, I would say, compared to many countries, precisely because our answer to bad speech from day one has been counter speech, precisely because of the First Amendment. And that, I think, is what has allowed us to weather relatively well the shock to the information ecosystem that we had 20 years ago because of the internet, and I think is allowing us to weather generative AI as well reasonably well. And when we look at bad actors using generative AI, sure, they can more easily create false information. That was never the hard part. Anyone could have used Photoshop to create realistic-looking images, at any point. And sure, generative AI makes that easier. But I think because we have these institutions, because we have, still a reasonably well-functioning press, those are the ways in which we have been able to react to these information harms. And I think those are the things that we need to continue to rely on.
Fantastic. We do worry about news reported in the major media. So everything come up in New York Times, of course, we pay a lot of attention, right? So, Carl?
Yeah, hi guys. My name's Carl Vondrick. I'm a professor in computer science here at Columbia. I work on computer vision. Am I worried? I'm worried about us, but I'm not worried about the next generation. I feel like we're going to get fooled by these systems, and I already am fooled by it. I go on social media and I see pictures that are fake, and I don't realize it. But I think your point somehow is that we're self-correcting. So I think the younger generation is going to learn, let's just not trust a photograph now, right? Which I find fascinating. A photograph basically was only truth for about 100 years, right? But 100 years ago, the first commodity camera came out, and you could use it as photographic proof, and not anymore, right? So I do think there is this natural self-correction that the next generation will just view all this as BS and not trust it in the first place.
I love the optimism, right? That's why we love the young students in our classroom also, right? So we already have a lot of questions, but let me come back to the audience question later on. But follow on the first round of the question on worrying about potential harm or falling into the bad actor hands. Let me follow by the second question is, can you pick one concern or one potential harm you're most concerned about with? And then share your experience and what you have seen in your community about maybe one of the most promising efforts you have seen to mitigate and to address the issue and make the AI tool potentially more reliable, trustable. Should we go in that order? Maybe Carl, you can go first.
Sure. I guess one thing I worry about is just generative AI making more bubbles for us to live in. We already have this to some extent where people listen to their own news station, and they just, our nation gets more divided because of that. With generative AI, it just can get more and more. Like I got my personal news station just tailored to me and my biases and everyone, and just this will divide us more and more. With augmented reality goggles, this will get even worse, right? We'll be seeing a different reality all the time. I unfortunately don't really have a good solution for it.
We'll look at the younger generation to help.
This is the big problem. Social media, I think, is this big problem. And with generative AI being spread around, we're just going to live in our own bubble and I think get more divided. And then we're all going to have different experiences and different facts of our life that's not good. So I don't know if it's a technological problem, though. It's probably more of a societal problem that needs to be addressed. So.
And that's why we have this partnership with the Knight Institute to join to look at legal. I'm deferring the tough question to my colleague here. Arvind?
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I'm actually going to pick up on exactly that. To what extent is this even a technology problem? And I notice we're all engineers here on this panel. I don't know if we're the right ones to, or only the right ones to talk about it. To the point that the photograph is no longer a marker of authenticity, I think that's really the critical point. And I forget who I heard this from, but there's this brilliant historical analogy that the same thing happened with the written word when the printing press came out. Before that, the written word was the word of God because only monks and scribes were able to produce it. And so there was a certain amount of reliability by certain definitions of reliability that was attached to the written word, and then just suddenly it went away. And that's why the intelligentsia back then, I think, reacted so awfully negatively to the printing press. And I think a lot of what's going on here is perhaps the analog of that. Something we've relied on as the marker of authenticity, which is realism in media, is all of a sudden going away. And like you said, I think people are going to adapt, especially people who are growing up with this. But I think that's a huge social cost. That adaptation is not going to happen instantly. And so we have to think about how is that social cost distributed? Are the companies who are responsible for producing these technologies bearing any of that social cost? And I think that's one of the big questions to me. And so how can you realign incentives there? So going back to your question of what kinds of technological interventions can help, I think I'd rather think about technological interventions that help people adapt as opposed to technological interventions that try to suppress the ability to create certain types of information. And to me, number one there is there have been a wave of recent announcements on watermarking. The reason I think I find that promising is not so that you can look at a particular piece of media and you can be like, oh, this is fake or this is real. I don't think people are really going to operate like that, much less automatic, suppression of certain information. But I think the reason this is crucially important is that as the envelope of generative AI capabilities quickly advances, seeing these watermarked images on social media as you scroll through them, seeing that this realistic looking video actually was generated by OpenAI's Sora, that is a vital way to give people the intuition that they need to let them realize where generative AI capability is month to month and to allow them to adapt and to make more informed decisions about how they consume information on social media.
So on that, I saw you have a post on fingerprinting also instead of a watermarking. Do you want to elaborate on that? Since, I mean, Arvind, you seems to have mentioned before in your maybe article, using fingerprinting to detect the possible fake content from one platform to the other platform.
Ah, right. Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah. So as I was saying earlier, we have to rely on existing institutions like the media, and that includes fact-checking. So one of the vital ways in which I think fact-checkers can be much more effective than they are now is if a particular piece of media has been fact-checked and actually found to be fake, whether it's AI generated or not, that almost doesn't matter. Once that information is there, as things stand today, that information doesn't propagate to other platforms. So there are many cases where fact-checkers operate on one platform and there is either a warning note or it's taken down or whatever on a particular platform, and then the people posting it just move to another platform where it continues to get hundreds of millions of views. And that's a really unfortunate situation. That's low-hanging fruit. There is a technological solution to that, which is to have databases of fingerprinted media along with fact-checkers' annotations of that media, a database which is shared between different social media platforms, which would really help amplify the effectiveness, I think, of fact-checking efforts.
Yeah, thank you. Smaranda, you want to talk about it?
Yes, sure. So I'll pick on something that Arvind was mentioning about the idea of fact-checking and having these tools help journalists, for example, fact-checking if a piece of information is correct or not. Most of the time, this fact-checking is not only true or false, so we really need to identify misleading content and how to characterize that. And we have developing, actually, in my group, a way of looking at this misleading content and characterizing with the help of domain experts from journalism, communication science, for example. You might have language-related, like exaggeration or slogans, or you might have, for example, fallacy, like logical fallacy, or structural, where you have people making claims without supporting evidence. And we kind of benchmark where these AI systems, and it's not only directly large language model, it's what Dilek was mentioning this morning, kind of equipping language model with external knowledge to be able to verify that as well. So language models and the systems are good at some of them, for example, language or structural, but less likely at logical, and I think humans are not there yet as well. So developing this system of kind of trying to detect but also explain, and having this system as a human in the loop as being technologies that help, for example, the domain experts, I think that's kind of very, very important. And in terms of the mitigations, one of the things that we noticed, and again in the other discussion in the morning, was we have false information or factually wrong information. So developing and mitigating strategies where the system, instead of just responding to whatever questions, it actually detects where it doesn't have enough information to respond, I don't know. Rather than just really generating an answer, can we figure out when the model is less confident to just say, I don't know the answer to that. So I think that's a promising direction.
So not only randomly generated output, also honestly answer the question that doesn't know the answer.
Right.
Or is that grounded in some knowledge, as Derek mentioned this morning, right? Yeah, exactly. So let me go to the next question. Actually, it's also triggered by one of the questions from the audience here. So one of the panelists, I think it's Alex, mentioned AI is already in the wrong hands. I think some of you others maybe concur with this point. But what then are the right hands? Are there good use cases? Or what is, in your view, the biggest opportunity for AI to have a positive societal impact?
That is a tough question, but I do think that AI as a technology in general will impact every single industry. And I do believe that by making things more efficient, it lowers costs and that increases access. So there are a lot of really good things about AI. And the key thing is to leverage those technologies in those industries and specific applications where we know They will advance certain goals. Like we will look at the work that the UN does or that governments do to educate the public, to have their citizens have more access to information. Gen AI can be very powerful in helping people find what they need in terms of government services, in healthcare and education. So I think the key is to, at the same time as we understand the risks, that we work really hard on leveraging the benefits, and that instead of focusing on the doomsday scenarios of 20 or 30 years, and that goes to what Arvind was saying about, if it's in the news, don't worry about it. I do agree in that sense, right? But I think there's a lot that can be done today, and the applications are endless, I think, in terms of positive impact. I think in the public discourse space in particular, one of the things that's really interesting is, yeah, I agree our generation will suffer more, but I think it's going to be a long time, right? Like I don't see the 10-year-olds being ready yet. Maybe the kids that are being born today will be ready for what's coming. So I think it's going to take a whole generation. It'll be a long time before humans really know how to deal with this. One thing that has changed is the speed at which we consume information and the speed at which things change. So I think access to real-time information is going to be critical, and the fact that today we're getting used to the idea that we see something and then the next day we realize, oh wait, that was not actually true. So you believed it for a very short amount of time. So the more we can compress that amount of time in which people access false information and believe false narratives, the better. Now the biggest challenge is that a lot of this has to do with how we function as humans, the human biases that we have, and the fact that we consume stuff and it's just confirmation bias. So I think the opportunity that I haven't seen much of yet and that I hope we get to is a lot of tools for the average consumer, the same way that some journalists have tools to verify information and to vet what they're getting. I think that's going to be critical. So I see a lot of opportunities in some of the platforms building tools and startups building tools for just standard consumers that will help them make better decisions on what they're consuming and what they're doing.
So some of the social media platforms do allow maybe a group of users to vet, to add their maybe vote of confidence or in terms of authenticity. Have you seen that kind of tool in your company or other industry players?
I mean, that's a large part of what we do internally for the alerts that we send out. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen this at scale yet. I mean, companies do try, and it's a very, very hard problem. And I think in large part, what is probably needed the most is more education on critical thinking. I think consumers and people individually have to make an effort. Like the bar has gotten higher for all of us, whether you're technologists or not. And it's naive to expect the tools to do it for us. And so that's why I think it's going to take a while for us to educate kids so that they're much more critical in what they see and what they consume. Maybe the same way that it happened in the 1700s with the print media. Right at the beginning, maybe everyone believed everything that was printed. And over time, people started understanding that there is bias in certain publications and to pick certain publications over others, and understanding that if they wanted a more balanced view, they needed to look at multiple places. And I think we're not there yet with the platforms. And in some ways we are, because we're consuming stuff from many different sources. The problem is that the stuff we're consuming is determined by algorithms which are reinforcing our own biases.
Kathy?
So I think there is definitely room for AI and large language modeling to do good. I think there are a number of applications that would have strong social impact. For example, in the field of mental health or the field of medicine, these are two areas. And I also think, which I'll say a little more later this afternoon, in encouraging or public discourse. In the area of mental health, I've been working with several collaborators where we're looking at developing tools for detecting emotions of distress that are posted online. One of my collaborators is from the field of social work, The other is from linguistics. And she specializes in analysis of African American language. And so we have been looking at creating these tools which can detect when people experience grief or very strong emotions in reaction to the events of our time. It might have been COVID earlier on, police brutality, or personal events when someone close to you dies. And the idea is that that people post a lot on social media, often about these things, but there's so much and it can be buried that it can be hard to detect. And if we can develop tools that can go through large amounts of posting to pick out problematic posts, then people from social work or other psychological areas can intervene to help the people who are feeling loss. So that's, I think, one example of a good application where we're in the right place and time to be able to do that.
Thank you. Smaranda.
Yes, so I think there is a lot of opportunity for social good of the system. And for example, in the public discourse, there is a lot of effort done in building these end-to-end fact checkers that can help, for example, a journalist fact check news. The other application here, I would also see this, and this goes to the kind of the idea of the counter speech of can we actually, where there is a controversial statement, present to the user not only one answer, but present the different perspectives or summarizing perspective that exist in various news, for example, or online sources. So having this type of technology which underlines different perspective and then characterizing this perspective, saying, what's the fundamental idea of in this perspective versus the other. I think that's going to be very, very helpful. But I think what is very critical here when we're developing the system to have this human-AI collaboration and really building the system with the domain expert in mind. And we have also been looking and collaborating actually with New York Times through a fellowship with one of my students. We're looking at automatically generating open-ended questions from particular sources. And this has been used, for example, in the newsroom to generate frequently asked questions around particular topics, emergent topics that exist. So I think we can develop this technology that could be useful for different domain experts and in different ways.
Fantastic. I think we should spend more time on the positive societal impact, make it feel more encouraged, more optimistic. I'm looking at the question from the audience here, and we're looking at my prepared question. I said, the question from this is much more interesting. So I'm going to go out of the script and ask some of the question from the audience here, right? So one question. There's an effect called continued inference effect. That's the tendency of a misinformation to continue influencing people thinking after the misinformation has been corrected. Do you see watermark of AI-generated image actually is able to interrupt this phenomenon? Even if you have watermark to tell this is true or false, but there is already, in effect, influencing the thinking of the consumer and the user there. Anyone want to take on this?
I would say no. On one hand, the watermarks will come from the large systems, right? So if you're using an API from a large company to create your content, it'll have the watermark, so you can say, okay, it came from a legitimate source, or you can trace where it came from. But as I said earlier, one of the problems is a lot of the models are open source, and those will get better and better, which gives bad actors the ability to create content that is indistinguishable from good content that was created in a legitimate platform and that doesn't have any kind of watermark. And second, people do have biases, and they view it as a confirmation of whatever that bias is. So even if you tell them this is not true, they might still say, well, I'm being tricked here. It is true.
And
or the other way around, right?
The question is this continued inference effect. The first impression has been made already, even you have a watermark to correct or maybe verify, or the other way, disrupt, is that impression can be corrected, right? Any other response?
Yeah, I like that answer, and I would say, the way I think about the influence of information, whether misinformation, disinformation, or accurate information on people, is a little bit different from kind of the implicit perspective in that question, which is that you have one piece of information, and then someone sees it, and they update their beliefs, and then later, do they correct it or not? I'm not sure if the research suggests that that's how people form and update beliefs. It has a lot more to do with their identity. Which social group is that information coming from? Is it the in-group or the out-group? And by trusting a piece of information, what are they signaling about their loyalty to their in-group and out-group? It's those kinds of psychological theories that have been much more accurate at explaining and predicting how people react to information. So to me, the benefit of watermarks is not so much in the impact that it might have on individuals when it's applied to specific pieces of information, but how it can help professionals who are hopefully have some amount of trust among the public. And that's a big question, but assuming that to some extent the media and fact checkers are trusted, for instance, watermarks could help them do their jobs a lot better. So that to me is a much more compelling, useful aspect of watermarks. And like I was saying earlier, it helps people not with specific pieces of information, but generally get a sense of what generative AI is even capable of. And so from those collective systemic perspectives, I'm much more optimistic about watermarks than about getting someone to update their belief on some specific fact that they may have seen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's related to image forensics, where you can actually, in a court, identify whether the photograph was taken by a particular camera, particular model, et cetera, et cetera. So if we could extend that to Gen AI or just images that are captured with cameras for consumers that have responsibilities of disseminating information like journalists, then that would definitely help. So it's more than just watermarking, right? It's provenance.
Kathy.
So I've like when Arvind mentioned the in-group and the out-group and who you're talking to, I find this very interesting. And in fact, we wrote a proposal on this to the NSF, which was not funded. So our ideas were not good enough. But we were thinking about how we could expose people to information that was not something they were normally exposed to, and how they might be able to accept it, whereas prior they were not. And we were thinking about that people in the in-group use a certain language, may use a certain dialect, certain words. People in the out-group use other kinds of language. And if we could rewrite information in the language of the in-group, that we could test whether it was possible for people to change their points of view. As is often the case when I have a proposal rejected, I think about it for a long time afterwards. I am often sure it's something that we should look at further and that would be possible. I think in this case, maybe this would be a case where it would be really good to work in a more interdisciplinary setting with people who are knowledgeable about communication and perhaps the psychology of how people change their minds.
Okay, perfect cue. My next question, interdisciplinary collaboration. And coming back to my script. These are critical efforts to make progress and solve some of the challenge, address the concern. What are the obstacles you see in your field or in your past effort exist for interdisciplinary collaboration, particularly in generative AI area? Carl, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I noticed we've been talking a lot about kind of the downsides of generative AI, especially in kind of text and vision, but also so much other potential in other domains. Like you could use generative AI in climate to better forecast what the climate's going to be like, or in drug discovery, can you design new drugs? And so that's definitely a case where you want to have this interdisciplinary collaboration, where as you build these algorithms that are solving the tasks that our brain is able to solve so well, maybe it's a breakthrough in the machine learning and the AI behind it that can then be transferred to these other domains, like in drug discovery and climate. So I think a lot of the barriers there, it just takes time, basically, to spread this technology around and make it available. So that's often one of the main barriers here.
But hopefully, with the prevalence of the AI tool right now and the bar of using is lower, I think it will be easier to start the interest and also collaboration.
Right.
Arvind?
Sure. So when I think about my own research, let me tell you one of the biggest barriers that I'm facing. So I'd really like to know how often are large language models in particular giving people bad medical information or financial information or legal information, which we, from anecdotes, we strongly suspect is happening on a large scale, but it's very hard to quantify. And the reason it's hard to quantify is because the vast majority of the widely used tools these days are proprietary, and we have absolutely no visibility into the interaction between users and these tools. We've been here before with social media. We've wanted to quantify how much of various types of problematic information is propagating online. And something that's made a big difference is transparency efforts by social media companies, sometimes as the result of public pressure, sometimes as the result of regulation, that has given us some idea of what is propagating online. And we have none of that visibility when it comes to large language models. I mean, this is a little bit of an interdisciplinary issue. I would love for computer scientists and social scientists and psychologists to work together, for instance. But a much bigger aspect of this is simply that companies are not opening up any of this information. I think there are, of course, valid privacy concerns, but I think there are technical ways to mitigate those privacy concerns. And to me, that is a huge barrier to understanding some of the major problems of these technologies, which is inaccurate information which is being thrown at unsuspecting everyday users, as opposed to bad actors maliciously putting bad information out there.
So there is an audience question actually very much related to what you just said, right? Transparency of the model, of the tool. And it's difficult to get information. Are there incentives that can be put in place to encourage more sharing, more transparency? I think that would be a question for the next panel. Jaimes, that's a question plenty for you. Okay, Smaranda, you want to take on this question also?
Sure, and I want to switch it back to kind of opportunities of cross-disciplinary interaction and kind of touching a bit with what Arvind was mentioning about understanding where either the domain experts or the user are using these technologies and how. So we have a collaboration, for example, with the School of Social Work and with the city medical examiner in New York City of trying to understand, for example, from investigative reports where the death is caused by an opioid overdose or not. So I think the goal here is actually to involve the domain experts and the user from the beginning of the developing of these systems. And rather than having models that make prediction, can we actually change and think about how are the people thinking about making this prediction of saying an opioid overdose? What are the features? And can we design system, for example, question answering, to be able to identify, well, okay, can I see in this investigative report a feature and provide an explanation, and then use this feature based from the document in a much more transparent machine learning, like logistic regression, for example, or something like that. So kind of having the domain expert providing some of these insights and then developing the system to be able to solve this, and then building models that are much more transparent rather than just throwing a large language model to the problem and making the prediction. And the other thing I think it's very important on how we have the user interact and where are they searching for using of the large language model. So I mentioned at the beginning some collaborations we have with emerging creative writers and how they use this technology now for writing. And then we design a system, a human AI collaboration system, where we try to understand from the perspective of the writer, in which stages of the creative writing process are they using? In planning, when they brainstorm, or when they have an idea and they want to translate in text and generating text, or as a feedback. And then we actually looked, and one of the interesting outcomes from there was that, well, they are trying to use the language model in all these stages. However, they identify drawbacks of saying, well, the language models are good enough at providing feedback, but they are really bad at planning and giving us suggestions for ideas, or even in the translating from the ideas to text. So kind of evaluating these language models by how the user are using them and identifying this, I think moving beyond benchmarking the evaluation and trying to really see how these technologies are evaluated and how they are used by the user, I think that's kind of an opportunity to have this interdisciplinary collaboration.
Fantastic. And so the infrastructure you talk about engaging the user to understand the process and maybe assess the creativity and addressing their need. Arvind talked about understanding how the model works, transparency, and we all know from the keynote speech this morning, training the model needs a lot of data. So in your view, this is open to the panel here. What kind of infrastructure are the most critical for scaling up the effort from you or from audience here to either address the bad behavior problem or maybe support the positive societal impact effort? What is the most critical infrastructure component you think we need to scale up the effort we can take here? Anyone volunteer? Alex? No volunteer.
I guess I was volunteered. I think there are different ways to answer the question. One is the data itself, and ImageNet was the data set that really started the boom in deep learning. But what people don't know is that before the ImageNet, there was TrekVid, and there were many other efforts in the research community to create common data sets. So I think that's one way where there's an infrastructure to create common data sets specifically for training large language models. I think one of the most interesting research questions, at least for me, is there a way to build these large language models so that they separate syntax and semantics? Right now, it's all mixed, right? The models learn about the world, I'm using it freely, although I don't really mean learn, but they extract statistical properties of elements in the world, but they're mixed. Knowledge and syntax are mixed. So imagine a world where you can build a model that just knows how to build sentences but doesn't know anything. And for that, you need the domain experts. And so you need a different data set that's vetted by expert. That's one possible research direction. And to do this, I think you need interdisciplinary teams collaborating across multiple institutions in different domains to carry that out. And I think lastly, we know compute is expensive, which is one of the reasons that a lot of this work is being done by large companies. So I think there's a need for institutions to collaborate and governments to provide platforms for institutions to experiment. Because I think a big key of this whole new wave of AI, and I say new in the last few years, is experimentation. And you need evaluation benchmarks, which again were very common back in the early 2000s with initiatives like TrekVid from NIST. We're not there yet. We haven't established those yet for large language models. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done. And then on top of that, of course, the legal and regulatory landscape, as that starts catching up, it might force incentives in some applications for more transparency. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me to regulate the technology on its own, but it does in specific applications. So if you're building a large language model for healthcare that's going to make medical decisions or aid in medical decisions, you can have regulation that says, well, you need to tell me how you trained it and how you got this data, and you have to guarantee certain accuracy because otherwise you're going to kill people. That's a very valid one. But saying you can't build models beyond a certain size or with these many parameters doesn't really help anybody because they're going to be built anyway outside of that framework.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the compute angle. I think that's absolutely right. It's like, if you look at who's building generative AI now, it's social media companies and search companies. And so that's what we're getting. It's great generative AI for social media posts and for doing search. And so if you gave that same compute to people in climate or in health or doctors or so on, right, it'd be a very different world we have. We wouldn't be worried about trust of this. We'd be worrying about, okay, is it actually designing all the right drugs for us? Is it actually forecasting the climate the right way? Right? So I think this is one of the huge barriers here is if we give compute to people who solve the problems we want to solve, they will go solve all of it, right?
And that's why actually several universities and also New York State governor effort recently launched the Empire AI effort to secure and establish a large quantity of compute power for university nonprofit organizations pursue large-scale AI model for society impact, right?
So I will jump in here also, inspired by these answers. So I think of two kinds of approaches to this. One is we should be working on technical approaches for smaller models. These larger models, the universities have difficulty having enough compute to use them or to train them initially. I think even companies that are not as big as some of these initial companies will have trouble using them. So I think we need to have research on smaller models that, perhaps reach within 1% of what the larger model can do, but do it at a much smaller percentage of the cost. And I do have one of my students working in this area on making use of diffusion models for text generation. It's not there yet to do what large language models can do, but it's getting there. And it's certainly much more efficient. Another thing I was going to say was, and this relates to what Carl said, is I think we need to think about building communities who will both inform how we develop our systems, will inform the choice of data, will inform what kind of use they want coming out of it. I think of it often in the case of, you heard Dilek this morning talking about human feedback, or maybe it was Tatsu who was talking about, they probably both. And right now it's used in a very generic way of, we take a whole group of people, heterogeneous, and we ask them their preference between two responses, and the model learns from that. But we could develop models that are personalized to different groups of people by, having preferences that are given to us by doctors, preferences that are given to us by psychologists. So we could capture by lawyers or by people in finance. We could capture interests of different people and develop more personalized models.
Yeah, fantastic.
So I just want one thing. I think I agree with everyone here in terms of the research. And one, I think, fundamental aspect that I think we have to pursue is also educating and using this into the educational, in teaching the classes about this, generative AI, including foundation and ethics, and infrastructure, including compute, of allowing students access to these resources to be able to actually build, let's say, projects in the class, exploring these various models. I think that's also one thing that we should push forward. I think
that's definitely needed. Compute power, data, user group, and also the infrastructure for us, our student, and us to experiment, pilot new idea, right? Yeah. Arvind, I know your hands raised.
Sure. I love that everyone has an answer to this infrastructure question, because it's a chance for us to bring all our gripes in terms of what we want to be able to do with this but can't. So one of those things for me is a lot of the safety research that I want to do on the dangers of these models. I can't do right now because it's against the terms of service. And companies have these informal promises that they won't enforce those terms of service against good faith researchers, but I'm not going to take that risk. And I know many, many others who are in that same position. So I think safe harbors for good faith safety research are just a really critical part. It's not compute infrastructure, which is also important, but it's legal infrastructure that is needed to enable this. Let me mention one more thing. So I think the way that we evaluate AI models today in the age of generative AI has gotten there's something fundamentally broken about it. Here's an example. When GPT-4 came out, OpenAI put out this amazing report saying it can pass the bar exam, medical exam, et cetera. It led to so many headlines about ChatGPT replacing lawyers. But when you look at the evidence, it's so far from that. There are regularly stories of lawyers who try to use it, and then it just makes up fake citations. They get sanctioned by the court, et cetera. That's happened dozens of times now. So what is happening? What is the gap? The gap is that when you evaluate these models on these static benchmarks, like bar exam questions, it doesn't tell you anything about their real-world performance. A lawyer's job is not to answer bar exam questions all day. A doctor's job is not to answer USMLE medical exam questions all day. And the gap between those is huge, and models completely fail in crossing that chasm. And that is not taken into account in any of the evaluations. Historically, for the last 50+ years, the absolute constant in AI evaluation ever since, I don't know, 1973 or so, Kathy might have a better idea, ever since benchmarking became the standard way of evaluating AI, you have a benchmark and then you optimize against that benchmark, right? And that last step of evaluating on the benchmark is automated, and then you just look at the number at the end. That whole paradigm is failing with generative AI because these are models you train once and then apply to thousands of different downstream tasks. And so to be able to actually measure real-world performance in any of those downstream tasks, you need domain experts in those particular areas. And the way that AI companies are evaluating these things just doesn't have that infrastructure at all. And I think that's a great opportunity for academia that has to come from law schools, from medical schools, from every one of those areas in which AI is being applied. And I think yeah, that's something where we can uniquely contribute as academics.
That's an excellent point, and also related to Alex mentioned earlier, right? If you want to regulate, if you want to audit, then maybe in a specific vertical domain, and you can define a clear benchmark and standard, we can try to solve the problem, reach the goal. But then the top question on my list here seems related, and I want to pose to the panel. If there is never a consensus on solution to this issue of fairness or ethics, and maybe a specific benchmark or application, will this cause the development of AI to stagnate, be banned like cloning technology, or fade out of the public eye? And it seems related that you articulated the need of a clear benchmark, and we can measure performance. You mentioned in the vertical specific application, we can audit, maybe in healthcare, in finance. There is a long tradition of auditing protocol and standard there. But if we are still debating on what is the important issue of ethics or fairness, there's no clear understanding or consensus on what to be addressed first. Where will this go?
I mean, but I would argue that's not new, right? It's never been static, right? Ethical notions change over time. They're different in different societies. I spent a number of years at Yahoo, and when we built stuff, we learned very quickly that in different countries, the level of what was acceptable and what wasn't in terms of content moderation was very, very different. And so that's a constant part of human nature, that societies change and evolve, and I think technologies have to adapt to that. So it's not ever going to be fixed, I don't think. I mean, there are certain things that as humans, we've gotten better at, and we've, that, 100 years ago were normal, and now it's like horrifying. Oh, I can't believe, people did this 150 years ago. And so I think understanding that and accepting that is important. And the key is, I think, making sure that those social norms and ethical norms, cultural norms, go hand in hand with the technology. And I think for me, one of the concerns is that it's not so much that people randomly generate bad content, but it's organized bad actors, which again is not new either, right? This has been done since the beginning of time, where governments and groups use technology to forward their position and power. And so how do we counter that now that we have these new tools that can be used by anybody?
Any other response?
Super quick response to that. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I don't mean to be glib, but when we talk about how do we make decisions in the absence of moral consensus, our answer to that is kind of democracy, right? It's politics. That's what we've come up with. I mean, it's not a perfect answer, but it's the best we've got. It works reasonably well. I think what's happening with these companies is that these products have so much power over society, and when companies are in a position to exercise that much power, I think we kind of demand democratic accountability, and right now we don't have that. So I think the concentration of power in the tech industry, I think, is really the root of that problem. And if that changes, then that will help address this question as well.
Interesting. Any other response on this? How to respond to take the action to measure the progress on fairness or ethics. Otherwise, let me jump to another very interesting question. As I keep reading that question, I cannot stop reading that. And because many of you mentioned the next generation will be able to adapt and also to develop their behavior, how to use the tool, right? But the question here is, young people can adapt, sure. But can we accommodate a level of skepticism? What do we do when they no longer believe anything they see? But we, the older people, I'm not sure we're older people, but who set the rule in society still believe. Interesting question. Any thoughts?
Punt to next panel.
Okay.
I think young people believe different things. Like everybody, I mean, it's human nature. You believe different things. It's not young versus old. I think it's just, you know, maybe the way that information is consumed is different, and the way decisions are made are different. But I don't believe in that distinction between, you know, old people believe everything, and then young people don't believe anything.
Hopefully, they will be aware of the potential content is no longer just realistic, always trustworthy, and they will be willing to try new tools for fact-checking, attribution, right, source verification, which we probably are not as good as they are today or in the future.
I don't know. You know, I think people are lazy on one hand, and on the other hand, I think it's human nature to not do that extra work. You know, and that's why I said at the beginning that I think critical thinking education is really, really important. And if we start early, then the new generation that has been educated in that way will have the tools. I'm not sure that somebody who's 10 right now, you know, I don't know if, I'm not going to say it's too late, but I would say earlier is better in consuming the information and asking those questions.
So I feel that it's not a matter just of people won't believe anything, that they'll learn not to believe anything. I think they will learn how to make use of what they have, and they'll learn how to filter through what they need to filter through. I think of you know, discussions around how students use tools in the classroom, and whether, you know, whether it's good or not, and what would be good. And having a discussion with the children, I won't even say whether they were daughters or sons, to protect of a professor, where the professor was very clearly opposed to using any of these tools to do anything in the classroom, and having a discussion with the children when the professors were out of the room, and what they told me about how they did use it and how it was helpful. And they had, you know, they had figured it out. They had figured out that, you know, they couldn't plagiarize. They had figured out that models were wrong. They had figured out how to look at what was right, but they had also figured out that these models could help them get information for whatever, you know, problem they were working on at that point in time. And if they knew how to filter out what they got back, it could help them in terms of learning what they needed to learn. And, you know, we sort of go through that, like when Wikipedia first came out, it was like going to be replacing encyclopedias, and then there was a lot of uproar. Would this be, you know, would we be able to rely on this knowledge? And, you know, over time, people learn how to do it. And I think we see the same thing with people who are programming, you know, that they learn how to use the output of models to help them in ways that speeds up their productivity, but they don't take it all at face value because they know there will be errors. So I feel like people learn, young people learn how to make use of the tools in a realistic way.
Certainly, right. Carl, you work on non-text vision and visual aspect. What do you see?
Yeah, in terms of people adapting to it, yeah, I think that it's one of those things where people will just stop believing in a photograph if there's nothing cryptographically signed about it, that this actually came from a real camera. So I guess the analogy I was thinking about is, maybe when the internet was first and the web was first becoming popular, we used to type in our credit card number into any website and just trust that would be okay. And nowadays we know to all look for that lock sign and we trust that, right? So I think photographs will go the same way, as we will, unless that lock sign is there, and it has to be developed still. This is still, infrastructure has to be built. But once that is built, we will just basically trust that. And probably, I don't know. That's why I think about the next generation will just, I don't know what age this happens, but I think the next generation will demand that lock sign, right? I mean, my dad still types his credit card in all these places. It shouldn't be, right? So, right? And so I'm probably going to be listening to believing photographs I shouldn't be, right? But hopefully the next generation will be demanding and just implicitly always, need that some sort of symbol, some sort of, certificate that this actually came from a camera, and the chain of custody of that photo can be traced back to the exact camera that it came from.
Arvind.
Can I add a super quick thing to that? I love that analogy. There's an interesting history to the lock sign, to web certificates, TLS. The technology existed since the mid-90s, right? But it wasn't widely adopted until about a decade ago. And what changed it was the Snowden leaks. And then there was a huge push in the industry to recognize that the status quo was not okay. And that's when things really started changing. So I think similarly, the lock sign for photographs exists. There are many industry standards, C2PA and others, I forget. I think maybe this moment of kind of panic, if there's one good thing that might come out of it, I think it's the incentive for widespread adoption of those technologies.
Yeah, no, certainly. And we also this symposium in collaboration with our friend in Knight Institute and our colleague in journalism in law aspects certainly has a very high level of skepticism, investigation, going to fact checking. So I think their angle, their perspective certainly would be very useful for us to work together. How do we develop a successful tool like the lock sign for the future, right? So the next question I think is very important also, and have not had a chance to pose to you. Most of the work so far is heavily focused on English and Western industrialized society, user behavior community is all Western style industrialized English dominant corpus. What are all steps that might be useful to make large language model more diverse and more coverage around the world, different culture, different norm, different political system, different country? Kathy, you have worked on multilingual.
Yeah, so I was looking at Smaranda because we're working on this in one of our grants where we're looking at cross-cultural communication and violation of norms across culture. And I think there has been a lot of work that shows even in multilingual models, there are many of the models are multilingual, so they can produce output in other languages. But the culture that they embody is typically Western. And so we need to do more training of models in different cultures. I guess one of my students is looking now at how culture can impact how we describe a piece of art. And he's looking at the difference between how large language models work with American pieces of art versus Chinese pieces of art. And he has some hypotheses about how a model that is a Chinese model should be able to do better. But the Chinese models are very small. They haven't been trained on as much data. I think, again, it's a question of data and really building up some of these larger models using data from other languages and other cultures so that we can encode knowledge that is not Western as part of them.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, I think I will echo Katie's. I think we have to come with creative ideas of how to develop this technology to become more culture aware. So we had some work on trying to identify, as Katie was mentioning, a lot of these norms, social norms, for example, are Western culture, so when we build this technology. So what we've been doing is trying to figure out these knowledge bases that have all these Western-derived norms. Can we build a system that automatically, for example, aligns situations in a Chinese culture and extract this information, for example, from online discussion that people have, for example, in the Chinese culture about what is standard, what is the norm for this particular situation, and then build models that, giving a situation, provides what is the English norm versus what is the Chinese norm and explain the differences. So I think it's really a very open problem, but I think we could actually go into trying to build these technologies to alleviate the problem of and equipping the model to get information from other cultures.
And also explore a new opportunity has never been possible before.
Exactly. Right? And then I think another side is, for example, developing these languages even more for endangered languages or very low resource languages, that one of the challenge there is that, well, even morphology is very, very complex into kind of how to build this model. So having completely different approaches of how to build these technologies for these endangered and low resource languages is still a challenge. And I think throwing the large language model at these problems, I don't think is going to be good. Yeah.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I want to ask a quick question, and as a bridge to the next panel, is we talk about a lot of a technical solution or concern opportunity. In your view and experience, what are the most important non-technical solutions or efforts we should pursue? Or we should pose the question to the next panel. What is the most important non-technical policy legal question you think that this collaboration should explore? Arvind?
One word, institutions.
Institution. Do you want to elaborate more?
I mean,
next panel too.
The media is one that we talked about, right? I think these problems arise not because of the technology itself, but what it does to institutions that might already be weak in some way. You know, whether it's K through 12 education, right? When teachers are already overburdened and under-resourced, then the introduction of Gen AI and kids using it for purposes they shouldn't. That's a big deal. As opposed to, let's say, in a well-resourced institution like this one, we're in a position of privilege to incorporate that and revamp our curricula, whatever is needed to take advantage of it really well. So I think the root of the problem is the institutions that are struggling with adapting to a new technology. So I think we should shore up those institutions.
Fantastic. Anyone else?
I don't know what the policy or particularly what the problem is that we should be looking at. But I do know that we need to work together to do it. So I believe we need people from the legal side, people from policy, people from the technology side, and that has to include people at the university as well as people from the tech companies. I think right now when you see these presentations to Congress, they are almost always with the heads or people from the tech companies, and they have a particular agenda. So I think we need to have people who are, a bit more open. And then, of course, people in government.
It's the only tech company representative. Do you want to rebut?
No, I agree. And I think the applications themselves, one thing that was said about experimentation, and for those of you building startups and working in industry, if you want to be successful in deploying AI, you take these large language models and you adapt them. So you need data, you need expertise, you need compute. And then you need to understand the application domain, and you need to work in that space, and it has to be an interdisciplinary effort. So I think in terms of guidelines or regulations in areas like education, and I mentioned healthcare, There are some industries that have been heavily regulated in the past, and it's worked, and it's been useful. Finance is one of them. So we can learn from all of that. But yeah, it's right now it feels like everything is an afterthought. It's like LLMs, and then everybody else comes running. Okay, what do we do now? So we need more integration so that these things are deployed in the right way with the right guardrails.
Okay, with that, I want to thank all the panelists and thank for your engagement and questions.